Hey guys, tonight we're diving into a topic that might just solve mysteries you never had an explanation for. Ever wondered what it was actually like to live in a medieval castle? You might picture grand, towering stone walls, a royal family seated at a lavish banquet, and maybe even knights and dragons. But the truth is far less glamorous. Life in a medieval castle wasn't as glamorous as you might think. It was, in fact, before you explore the story with me, please take a moment to help me subscribe to the channel, like and share this video, or maybe leave a comment below. But make sure you do it when you really like what I bring to you. Where and when did you start watching this video? Feel free to share your thoughts, or even a compliment. I'd love to hear from you. Let's keep the lights as soft as possible. Turn on the fan for a gentle sound to help the story feel more emotional, and let's embark on tonight's journey together. Living in a medieval castle wasn't the fairy tale we imagine today. Cold, cramped, and uncomfortable. The stone walls that made the castle so imposing and formidable were also a curse. You might think that these castles were well equipped to handle the elements, but in truth, they were made of thick stone, which, while excellent for defense, was terrible for insulation. The winters were brutal, and you'd wake up to a room that was colder than the air outside. Imagine yourself trudging through a hall, your breath visible in the frigid air as you head toward the great hall for your morning meal, if there was even enough food to satisfy your hunger. Those grand windows, allowing little light to warm the rooms. The stone wasn't the only issue. There was no central heating system, and the few fireplaces that existed could hardly make a dent in the cold. Did you know that most castles didn't even have any kind of insulation in the floors, walls, or ceilings? You'd feel every draft and hear every creak of the cold structure. Some castles were so poorly heated that in the winter, the stone floors would freeze to the touch. Historians still argue whether any medieval ruler could ever find a way to truly make their castle livable during these months, and most agree that it was probably a struggle just to stay warm. The castle's interior, which might look majestic on the outside, was a reflection of medieval survival. If you weren't cold from the stone walls, you were likely wet from the ever-present dampness. Castles didn't have the plumbing systems we take for granted today, and that means no hot water or heated showers. Every surface was prone to the creeping dampness of the castle's interior. The constant draft from poorly sealed doors and windows made it feel like the cold was following you everywhere. You could try to wrap yourself in blankets or warm furs, but the chill would seep into your bones anyway. You'd constantly battle against the wet cold, and the only relief came from those few moments next to a fire. Not every room had one, and even the fires were not enough to beat back the cold. Those grand garments were not just heavy, they were uncomfortable and impractical. The noble men and women who lived in these castles might have looked elegant, but under their layers of wool, linen, and silk, they were often suffering from chafing and the general discomfort of garments that weren't made for everyday wear. Historians often marvel at the sheer bulk of medieval clothing, which was designed not just for warmth but to display status. You'd be living in multiple layers of fabric without a helping hand. Did you know that medieval shoes were as uncomfortable as their clothing? They were made from stiff leather and often didn't fit well, leading to blisters and sore. These weren't the cozy slippers you might wear before bed. These shoes were designed for endurance, not comfort. Think about this for a moment. You're constantly trudging from room to room, your feet aching, your body weighed down by heavy fabrics, all the while surrounded by an unrelenting cold. It's no wonder that many who lived in these castles struggled with fatigue and ailments. The life of a noble within a medieval castle was far from a life of luxury. You had a place to sleep and meals served to you, but it came with a price, literal and figurative. The constant cold, the discomfort of your clothes, and the never-ending battle with the damp made the castle seem more like a fortress of misery than a place of refuge. As you continue to imagine the medieval castle, let's turn our attention to another uncomfortable reality. You might think that the nobles and royals who lived in these castles enjoyed luxurious, flowing garments draped in silks and velvets. Well, that's half true. What they wore was often heavy, uncomfortable, and ill-suited for the daily struggles they faced. How did they manage the cold? Let's step into their shoes. Literally, the clothing of the medieval period, especially for those who lived in castles, was not the elegant attire we think of today. Imagine layers upon layers of thick fabric, often wool, and topped off with heavy furs. These garments were designed to showcase wealth and status. They were anything but comfortable. You'd be wearing several layers of thick, stifling material, making it nearly impossible to move freely. And forget about breathability. These clothes weren't made to keep you cool. You'd sweat in the same garments you wore through the bitter cold, and the thick fabric trapped the warmth in a way that made it impossible to cool down. But it wasn't just the weight of the clothing that made it unbearable. Medieval fashion wasn't about comfort. It was about showing a place in society. The nobles were decked out in outfits that were often too tight or too loose, made of materials that didn't allow for easy movement. Corsets, bodices, and overly complex fastenings meant that it took ages just to get dressed in the morning, and the discomfort only intensified once the day was underway. And don't forget those medieval shoes. No soft leather moccasins here. These shoes were made from thick, stiff leather that often pinched and hurt. Historians argue whether medieval clothing truly reflected the wearer's status, or whether it was simply an impractical relic of the time. Many claim that the discomfort of medieval clothing was a byproduct of trying to display one's wealth and power. However, others suggest that these garments were purely practical. They provided warmth and protection from the harsh elements outside. The debate continues, but one thing is clear. No matter the reason, living in these clothes was hardly a pleasure. And what about the smell? Clothing wasn't washed regularly, and the medieval concept of hygiene was nothing like we know today. You'd likely wear the same outfit for days, or even weeks at a time. Combine that with the medieval stench of unbathed bodies, animals, and unventilated rooms, and you have a sensory experience that would be hard to escape. Your clothes would quickly absorb the dirt, sweat, and smells of everyday life, which wasn't just uncomfortable, it was downright unpleasant. Let's talk about the other element of clothing. Footwear was made from the same thick leather as the rest of the outfit, designed to last but not designed for comfort. The shoes were stiff and uncomfortable, little in the way of support or cushioning. You would have to wear these shoes day in and day out, whether you were walking around the castle or riding horseback. Your feet would be aching, and the last thing you wanted was to walk to the cold, hard stone floors of the castle with painful blisters and sore toes. But despite the discomfort, the clothing served an important function. Not only did it provide some protection against the harsh weather, but it was a marker of status. Nobles had to wear these layers of fabric and intricate designs to prove they were at the top of the social hierarchy. But as you can imagine, when you're dressed in layers of itchy wool and tight-fitting clothing, all while trying to manage the cold, sleep deprivation, and endless noise, you likely start questioning whether the effort was really worth it. You spent all day in a castle, freezing in your uncomfortable clothes, listening to the noise echo through the halls. And now you're about to head to bed, where you'll lie in a cold room with nothing but a thin blanket for warmth. Your shoes, still stiff from the days where, sit at the foot of your bed, and you're left to wonder if there's any way to escape this medieval nightmare. Now that you've settled into the idea of cold, uncomfortable clothing, let's delve into something that made life in a medieval castle even worse: the lack of privacy. You just gotten comfortable in your room, finally escaping the chaos of the bustling hallways, only to realize that your private space is anything but. You're surrounded by servants, family, and animals. There's no real solitude here. Living in a medieval castle, especially for those without the luxury of a private suite, meant sharing your space with anyone and everyone. The concept of privacy, as we know it today, didn't really exist back then. Who might have had slightly more control over their living quarters rarely had any kind of real privacy. Castle life was a communal affair. People slept in the same room, ate in the same hall, and often worked together in cramped, noisy spaces. Even the royal chambers, often grand and lavish, didn't offer the personal space we take for granted today. You might share your bedroom with other members of the family, servants, and guests who had nowhere else to go. Can you imagine lying in bed, trying to drift off to sleep, only to be disturbed by the muffled voices of others in the room? It wasn't uncommon for entire families to sleep in the same chamber, with little to no boundaries between them. And let's not forget about the servants who had to live and work in the castle. They didn't have separate living quarters like we do today. Lived in the same space, often relegated to the same small rooms or corridors where they ate, slept, and worked. Historians still debate whether the lack of privacy in the medieval period led to a greater sense of community, or whether it was simply a result of necessity. Either way, it would have been uncomfortable for anyone used to modern notions of space and solitude. Even the most prestigious castles were built with communal living in mind. Imagine walking to the halls of a massive stone structure, only to find people everywhere, some serving food, some whispering secrets, and others just milling about. There was no retreat from this hustle and bustle. If you want to get away from it all, you'd have to lock yourself in your room. But that wouldn't guarantee peace and quiet. you'd still be aware of the noises coming from the castle's corridors, the clatter of pots and pans, and the occasional shouted command from the lord or lady of the house. And with all these people sharing the same space, there was no escaping the smell. The stench of unwashed bodies, animals, and the pervasive dampness of the stone was ever present, seeping into everything. If you thought you could retreat to the castle's great hall for a moment of peace, the great hall, often the largest room in the castle, was a center of social activity. It was where feasts were held, business was conducted, and people gathered to listen to minstrels play or to hear news of the outside world. But this wasn't a place for solitude. The hall was always filled with people, and noise echoed off the stone walls. You would have little opportunity for quiet reflection in such a setting. Some historians argue that the lack of privacy in medieval castles helped shape the close-knit social structures of the time. Without the separation of space, people were forced to interact more with one another, creating bonds or intense rivalries. But for those who craved solitude, the constant presence of others would have been a source of constant frustration. Whether it was a daily noise or the ever-watchful eyes of family members and servants, there was no place to hide. You were always on display. And then, of course, it wasn't uncommon for animals to live inside the castle, especially in the colder months. They provided warmth and protection, but they also made everything more cramped and noisy. Cats, dogs, horses, and even pigs sometimes found themselves living alongside the humans. The air would have been thick with the smell of both humans and animals, a constant reminder of the lack of space and privacy. Imagine trying to sleep, only to hear the soft growl of a dog or the occasional snort of a pig in the corner of the room. It would be enough to drive anyone mad. The lack of privacy extended beyond just the living quarters. The very design of the castle made it difficult to escape from the eyes of others. Long corridors, narrow staircases, and large open spaces all meant that there was little chance for solitude. Whether you were walking to the bathroom or just trying to sneak away for a quiet moment, the castle also imprisoned its residents in a way that was impossible to escape. You're probably starting to realize that living in a medieval castle wasn't exactly the dream life we often imagine, but there's more to this story. When it comes to cleanliness, things were far from ideal. You just spent a long day working, walking through chilly stone corridors, attending to your duties, and dealing with the noise and crowds. You longed for a warm bath to relax. There was no running water, no showers, and certainly no luxury spas. Instead, you were left to deal with the uncomfortable, often unsanitary, conditions of medieval hygiene or the lack thereof. Medieval castles, despite their grandeur, didn't have plumbing. That's right, no faucets, no bath, and no way to easily wash your hands. The idea of taking a bath was quite different from what we know today. Bathing was an occasional event, typically involving a small tub or basin. The water was not readily available. Instead, it had to be carried from a well or nearby stream, which often meant a cold, laborious task that took hours to accomplish. And if you were a noble, the chances of getting a warm bath were even slimmer. While the rich could sometimes afford to bathe in heated water, it was still a rare luxury, and the cleanliness of the water was questionable at best. Historians often debate how much bathing actually occurred in the medieval period. Some argue that it was an infrequent practice, with people opting for more practical ways of staying clean, like wiping themselves down with rags or using perfume to mask body odor. Others believe that people bathe more often than we give them credit for, but with far less hygiene than we would consider acceptable today. Either way, the absence of running water and modern sanitation systems made hygiene a difficult and often unpleasant task. Even when people did manage to wash, the conditions were less than ideal. Public baths were common in some areas, and while they provided an opportunity for cleanliness, they were also breeding ground for disease. The water was often reused by multiple people, meaning that bacteria, sweat, and grime quickly accumulated. So while people might have been cleaning themselves, they were also exposed to a variety of health risks, including lice, skin infections, and other ailments. It wasn't uncommon for medieval towns and castles to be plagued with various diseases, many of which were spread through poor hygiene and close quarters. But even worse than the lack of bathing was the absence of proper waste disposal. Without modern toilets or sewage systems, people had to make do with chamber pots or the occasional outdoor latrine. These pots were often used in the privacy of a room, but their contents were rarely disposed of in a sanitary manner. The smell of human waste lingered in the air, and the stench of the castle was a constant reminder of the medieval struggle with hygiene. And while the nobility may have had more resources to keep their chambers free of such unpleasantness, The lower classes in the castle were often forced to live with it. Servants, workers, and even guests had little recourse when it came to proper waste disposal, leaving the castle itself an unsanitary place to inhabit. You might think that with all the suffering from inadequate hygiene, the castle would be a cleaner place overall, but that was far from the case. The lack of plumbing and modern cleaning tools meant that dust, dirt, and grime built up in every corner of the castle. The walls, floors, and even furniture collected layers of dirt, which could only be cleaned sporadically. And because the buildings were made of stone, the dust often mixed with the dampness in the air, creating a sticky, uncomfortable atmosphere. You breathe in the stale, musty air, and every movement you made seemed to kick up more dust. Imagine living in a constant state of grime, your clothing stained, your skin irritated, and the air heavy with the weight of medieval filth. But perhaps the most frustrating part of this medieval cleanliness struggle was the sheer lack of options for improvement, where you can simply turn on a faucet to get clean water. The residents of a castle had to wait for it to be fetched, boiled, and prepared. And even then, the water wasn't guaranteed to be clean or safe to use. So day after day, you'd go about your tasks, your body still dirty, your skin irritated, and your clothes clinging to your body in a less than pleasant way. Historians still argue about how the medieval mindset regarding cleanliness influenced health. Some believe that people simply accepted the lack of hygiene as part of life and did the best they could under the circumstances. Others think that the lack of cleanliness contributed to the constant outbreaks of diseases like dysentery, typhoid, and even the plague. The link between poor hygiene and disease is undeniable. Yet it wasn't until much later that people truly began to understand the importance of sanitation. So here you are, living in a castle, trying to navigate this medieval world, and the last thing on your mind is how dirty everything is. You're just focused on surviving the discomfort of your surroundings. From the cold stone walls to the constant noise and the lack of privacy, the cleanliness of your castle was simply an afterthought, one that made your daily life even more miserable than it had to be. Let's pause for a moment and imagine the worst part of all, living with rats and pests. Before you think it sounds like a bad horror movie, let's consider the reality of medieval life. Castles weren't just filled with humans, they were also full of unwanted, uninvited guests. Imagine sharing your bed with rodents, insects, and other pests, all of whom found your cozy stone walls to be a perfect home. The creaky wooden floors, the cracks in the stone, and the constant piles of food scraps made these castles an ideal environment for these tiny creatures. So when night fell, the last thing you want to do was settle into bed, knowing that these uninvited guests were creeping around. In a world without pest control, it was virtually impossible to keep castles free of rodents. The rats were drawn to the food scraps left over from meals, and they could often be found rummaging to the corners of rooms or hiding in the cracks of the stone walls. And it wasn't just rats. Mice, fleas, and other bugs were common in these environments. Musty conditions of the castle only made the problem worse. These pests thrived in the cold, dark corners of the building, and you had no choice but to live with them. The constant rustling of the walls, the faint sound of scampering paws across the floor. There was nowhere to escape them. Historians often debate the extent of the rodent problem in medieval castles. Some argue that it was worse than we can imagine, while others believe it was more manageable in castles with larger kitchens and better food storage. What is clear is that rodents, fleas, and other pests were an unfortunate reality for those living in these castles. The pests didn't just hang out in the corners. They were a constant threat to health. Fleas, for example, would bite and spread diseases like the plague, which often spread through towns and castles alike, leaving their inhabitants at the mercy of these tiny invaders. The idea of living in a place that smelled of decay, with rodents crawling to the walls, is enough to make anyone's skin crawl. But for those who lived in castles, this was just a part of their daily life. And even when you tried to clean, there was little to be done. The pest problem was simply an inescapable fact. You could sweep the floors, scrub the walls, and throw out food scraps, but as long as the conditions remained favorable to the rats and fleas, the infestation would continue. This constant battle with pests was one of the many miserable aspects of life in a medieval castle that most people didn't realize. To make matters worse, the lack of sanitation facilities meant that human waste was often left to fester inside the castle. Chamber pots, the medieval equivalent of a toilet, were used by both nobles and servants alike, and the contents were often thrown out the window or dumped into a pit outside. Imagine walking through the castle grounds, and suddenly the smell of human waste hits you. The flies, the rats, and the stench of decay would have been an ever-present part of your life. And while nobles might have had their own servants to help dispose of waste, they still had to contend with the pests and smells that followed them everywhere. In many ways, living in a medieval castle meant that there was no real escape from discomforts of daily life. Historians continue to study the impact of pests and disease on medieval life. Some believe that the spread of illness in these castles was inevitable due to the combination of poor hygiene and the presence of rodents. Others suggest that the constant exposure to pests and the lack of sanitation contributed to the overall sense of misery and discomfort in these castles. The presence of rats, fleas, and other pests was one of the darkest realities of medieval life, and it's something that few people truly understand when they picture the grandeur of these castles. Can you imagine trying to get a good night's sleep, knowing that at any moment something might crawl across your bed? Tiny paws scurrying across the floor, the sound of scratching the walls, would make anyone uneasy. Yet for those who lived in castles, this was just another part of the misery. Let's move on to the next element of castle life that made it a less than dreamy experience. You might envision a medieval castle glowing with the warm, flickering light of candles, creating an atmosphere of coziness and romance. The reality, however, was far more unsettling. The lighting in a medieval castle was limited and, at best, dim. Can you imagine trying to go about your day or get some rest in an environment where darkness reigned for most of the day, especially during the long, cold winters? Forget the soft, ambient light we enjoy today from electric bulbs. Here, your only source of illumination was the dim glow of candles or torches. In medieval castles, lighting was a luxury. Candles, while commonly used, were expensive and not always readily available. Most of the time, castles relied on torches, which were affixed to the walls and burned for a few hours before they needed to be replaced. The flickering light from these torches did little to illuminate the dark corners of the room. They cast long shadows and made the atmosphere feel eerier than inviting. And let's not forget about the smell. Torches often produce a smoky, acrid scent, filling the air with the stench of burning wood or animal fat. The light they offer might have been better than nothing, welcoming environment you might expect. Historians still argue whether the lighting in medieval castles ever reached a level that could be considered. Some believe that the dim light made everything feel more oppressive, while others suggest that people simply adapted to it, finding comfort in the atmosphere. But regardless of the debate, it's clear that life in a medieval castle was far from well lit. Most of the time, the stone walls, small windows, and lack of modern lighting left the castle shrouded in gloom. Even during the day, when the sun was out, the lighting was far from ideal. Castle windows were small and often covered with iron bars or wooden shutters, limiting the amount of light that could enter. You would have to rely on what little natural light filtered through these tiny openings, which made the castle feel even more enclosed and claustrophobic. The lack of windows not only kept the castle cold, but also contributed to the dreariness of the environment. Imagine sitting in your room, waiting for the sun to rise, but still feeling the heavy, cold shadows around you. On those rare occasions when the weather was mild, you might have had a brief respite from the gloom, but those moments were fleeting. For most of the year, you'd find yourself navigating dark halls and narrow corridors, trying to make your way to the great hall or dining area, guided only by the faint, flickering light of your torch. If you needed to read, write, or simply move around the castle, you had no choice but to make do with the inadequate lighting, which probably left you straining your eyes and feeling disoriented. The most unsettling part of this dim lighting, however, was the danger it posed. The lack of visibility in the castle meant that accidents were more likely to happen. You could easily trip on uneven floors, bump into furniture, or accidentally knock over a candle or torch, setting the entire room ablaze. Fires were a constant threat in medieval castles. Hiding an abundance of wooden furniture and beams, it was easy for a small flame to spiral out of control. And when the entire castle was shrouded in darkness for most of the day, it wasn't always clear whether you were safe or in immediate danger. Historians debate whether people simply grew used to living in the dark, or if the lighting in some way contributed to the sense of foreboding and unease that many medieval castle dwellers likely felt. One thing is certain, though. Life in a medieval castle was far from the cozy, well-lit environment that we imagined it to be. It was an atmosphere of shadow and uncertainty, where the flickering light of a torch was the only thing standing between you and complete darkness. And when the day ended and you finally retired to your cold, the darkness would only grow thicker. Imagine lying in your bed, staring into the gloom, hearing the sounds of creaking wood and the occasional scurrying of rats, and knowing that the only thing that stood between you and total darkness was a single, struggling candle. It's hard to imagine how anyone could get a peaceful night's rest in such an environment. The constant lack of proper lighting, combined with the other discomforts of castle life, would have made every night feel more like a battle for survival than a restful retreat. Let's move on to something that every resident of a medieval castle dreaded. When you picture a medieval castle, you might imagine it standing tall and imposing against the backdrop of rolling hills, a symbol of strength and protection. When the cold winter months rolled in, this same structure became a fortress of misery. Castles, despite their thick stone walls and towering battlements, were simply not designed to keep out the cold. Imagine waking up on a frosty morning, your breath visible in the air as you struggle to get out of your bed. The cold has already crept into your bones, and there's no escaping it. The cold stone walls are relentless, and the few fires that are kindled in the hearths can barely warm the rooms. Even though the fire in the great hall might be roaring, the heat doesn't travel far, leaving the rooms and corridors unbearably chilly. The floors, made of stone or rough wood, would freeze to the touch, leaving you no choice but to endure the biting cold. In medieval castles, insulation was a foreign concept. The thick stone walls, which were perfect for defense, offered little in the way of protection from the elements. Built for battle, became insufferable during the harsh winter months. You might huddle by a fire to try and get warm, but the coldness would seep into the stone, and the heat would dissipate quickly, leaving you as cold as ever. The windows, small and narrow, offered little protection from the wind, and the shutters that covered them only allowed the cold air to enter more easily. Historians still debate the extent to which medieval castle residents suffered in the winter. Some believe that it was more bearable than we imagine, with certain castles being better designed for winter living than others. Others argue that the cold was a constant struggle for everyone, regardless of their social status. The lack of insulation meant that there was no way to escape the chill, and even the nobility, who lived in the grander rooms, were forced to endure the discomfort. For the servants, who lived in the lower, less protected areas of the castle, the winter months must have been unbearable. But it wasn't just the cold that made winters in medieval castles miserable. With so many people and animals living in the same spaces, the risk of illness and disease increased. The cold temperatures made it difficult to keep the castle free from moisture, which led to mold and mildew. These unsanitary conditions were a breeding ground for bacteria, and with no modern medicine or proper health care, it was easy for disease to spread quickly. In a time when the winter months meant fewer fresh supplies and more limited access to food, this posed a constant threat to the health of everyone in the castle. And while you might think that the cold would be the biggest problem, it was also the most difficult to escape. The constant need for warmth meant that fires were kept burning in the hearths day and night. But it wasn't just the hearths that suffered. The stoves and chimneys were often poorly maintained, and the smoke that filled the rooms added to the discomfort. Imagine trying to breathe in an already stuffy, cold room filled with smoke. It must have been unbearable. The lack of modern technology also meant that people had little means of staying warm. There were no electric heaters or central heating systems, just a limited warmth from the hearth and the bodies of the people living in the space. And because medieval castles were often built in remote areas, far from access to resources like firewood or fuel, keeping the castle warm was a constant struggle. Some historians suggest that the lords of the castle would have had to rely on their subjects to bring firewood from distant forests, which would have been an exhausting and time-consuming task in itself, who had to live in the colder, less hospitable areas of the castle. Even the effort of gathering firewood would have been a constant source of misery. Historians argue whether the noble classes truly understood how miserable their servants' conditions were during the winter months. Servants who were tasked with tending to the fires and ensuring that the castle remained somewhat livable. But that didn't always mean they were treated kindly. The divide between the lords and the servants in medieval castles was vast, and the servants often suffered far more than the nobility. The lack of proper heating and insulation meant that everyone in the castle, from the highest lord to the lowest servant, had to endure the cold. It's a winter evening, and you're huddled by the fire, trying to stave off the chill. The cold seeps into every corner of the castle, and the darkness of the night only makes it worse. You hear the wind howling outside, the sound of it whistling through the cracks in the stone. You know that the winter months are just beginning, and the cold will only get worse. And even though you have a fire to warm you, the warmth doesn't last long. The thought of another long, cold night stretches before you, like an endless nightmare. Let's shift gears for a moment and talk about something that kept people on edge all the time: the constant threat of attack. Life in a medieval castle was not just about enduring physical discomfort. It was also about living in a state of perpetual anxiety. Every day brought with it the risk of an invasion. As you sat by your hearth, trying to keep warm, there was always that gnawing sense of dread that someone could breach the castle's walls at any moment. The very fortress that was supposed to offer you protection was also a constant reminder of the ever-present danger lurking outside. Imagine this. You're sitting down to a meal, perhaps in the grand hall, and suddenly the sound of horns blare through the air, signaling an incoming attack. Your heart races, and you spring into action, scrambling to grab your sword or your shield, ready to defend your home. But even though the castle walls are thick and imposing, you know that they're not invincible. You live with the knowledge that enemies, both foreign and local, might be gathering just outside the gates, ready to storm your home. The constant vigilance required to survive in such a place was mentally and emotionally exhausting. Castles were designed to withstand these kinds of attacks, but even the strongest fortifications had weaknesses. The drawbridge, which was meant to protect the castle from intruders, could be quickly lowered, making it vulnerable to assault. The castle gates, made of wood and iron, were strong but could be breached with enough force or cunning. You might think that a castle's defenses would make life easy, but the reality was far from it. The threat of attack was always there, and it added to the mental strain of living in a medieval castle. Historians argue whether the constant fear of attack was ever truly justified. Some suggest that medieval castles were often more symbolic of power than practical fortresses, designed to intimidate rather than offer real protection. Others believe that the threat of attack was always imminent, particularly during times of political unrest or war. Regardless of the specifics, the sense of danger and paranoia was a constant presence in castle life. No one could ever truly relax, knowing that their fortress might be compromised at any moment. But it wasn't just the risk of attack that kept people on edge. The constant presence of soldiers, guards, and other defenders only served to remind you that you were always at risk. The castle's defense mechanisms, including the towers, battlements, and fortifications, were a constant reminder that danger could strike at any moment. Imagine having to constantly live in a state of readiness, where every noise could be the sound of an intruder, every movement could be the prelude to an attack. Life in a medieval castle wasn't just about surviving the cold or enduring discomfort. It was about surviving the constant fear of war. And then there was the psychological toll. Imagine not only living with the fear of an invasion, but also knowing that your actions, and the actions of those in the castle with you, could determine the outcome of a siege. The pressure was immense. You weren't just trying to protect yourself. You were responsible for the lives of everyone who depended on you, from the nobility to the lowliest servant. Everyone relied on the castle's defenses to keep them safe. If the castle fell, so did everything inside it. Historians still debate how much the threat of attack influenced the mental well-being of those living in castles. Some argue that the constant anxiety led to heightened tensions and mental stress, making people more prone to conflict with each other. Others believe that the threat of attack created a sense of unity and purpose, with everyone working together to maintain the security of the castle. But what is clear is that living in a castle meant never being able to let your guard down, even for a moment. The wind is howling outside, and you're huddled in your room, trying to keep warm, but you can't shake the feeling of unease. Every creak of the floorboards, every sound of footsteps in the hall makes your heart race. It could happen at any time. The constant tension, the constant vigilance, takes its toll. You might even question if the castle's walls are as strong as they once seemed. No amount of stone or iron can protect you from the mental toll of living in constant fear.